is to answer a question that is currently being discussed widely around the world, and particularly in Paris today. And the question is the following: will today's energy and environmental problems be solved in 100 years? And the point I would like to make is that we know enough about the technological and economic aspects of the present energy and environmental problems to anticipate with reasonable confidence that they will be solved by the end of the 21st century. However, the bridging of the wide gap between energy consumption per capita in rich countries and poor countries will require more than technology. I think the way I will try to convince you of that is the following. This is the way energy is consumed in the world today, and the graph shows the evolution since 1850. And as you can see here, until 1850, and over thousands of years before then, most of the energy was supplied by wood for warming the houses, for cooking, and for all kinds of other activities. And that was the first energy revolution that we had when man discovered fire. Then we had a second one, which started later on, approximately in 1850, which was the ascent of coal, which dominated, of course, the picture. And by the beginning of the 20th century, was becoming dominant. Then what happened is that oil became dominant and coal went slowly down here. And finally, we had gas, which is growing now, and very soon will become dominant in the world. And finally, here we have different types of renewable sources of energy, which will become dominant later on in the century. So you see here that we have had 4 revolutions. The first one was the one using biomass, which came with the discovery of fire, then coal, then oil, then gas, and then in the future, renewables. Now, why is this so important? It is important because there are 3 essential ingredients for human life and human habits of consumption, which are air, water, and energy. I will not discuss water, which is a problem that so far is a localized problem in some parts of the world, including California and Brazil by that way, but it's still localized. But the problems of air and energy are becoming global problems. And the reason why this is happening is because man, now, with 7 billion people in the surface of the Earth, has become a geological force. This was not so in the past. The action of man over nature was really superficial. People became very competent and very efficient in killing each other, but harming nature was not within the capabilities of the technology of the old days. And, but that began to change. And today, just to give you an example, every one of us on the Earth, on the average, moves around about 8 tons of matter per day. Just think about your own life, purchasing gasoline or stuff in the supermarket and so on, and you will immediately realize that that's a reasonable number. Of course, in the United States, it's more than 8 tons per day. In India, it's less than 8 tons per day. But on the average, it's approximately 8 tons of matter per day. If you multiply that by 7 billion, you get approximately 50 billion tons of stuff. And that's the amount of geological forces that we have in the world. Wind, volcano eruptions, and so on and so forth. So You know, this is why people think that we are entering a period of history, which is the anthropomorph. It's a new stage of development in which man really developed the ability of changing the composition of the atmosphere and exhausting some natural resources. And of course, people began to realize that something like that was happening about 2 centuries ago. But people that perceived that were really worrying about the current generation, about their own lives. And the first ones that realized that were the foresters. And as you know, Europe was heavily deforested at one time, but then people realized that that was hurting a lot of other activities and the water supply and so on, and they began reforesting. Adam Smith realized that you have problems if you exhaust natural resources like fisheries and other things. And apparently the first one that really worried about future generations and intergenerational events was Kant. You know, Immanuel Kant formulated these ideas about universalization of access and the consequences that that could have. Now, what's happening is the following, is that as we moved from biomass, which is renewable, which means that we can cut the trees and then they will regrow and all that and so on, when we move to fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and gas, we are throwing reserves that are underground and converting them into a gas which goes into the atmosphere. And we are changing the composition of the atmosphere. The amount, just to give an example, the amount of CO2, which is the result of the combustion of fossil fuels, is getting closer to doubling the value that it had 200 years ago. And this is why we have climate change, and of course the Earth is warming up, and the consequences for climate are beginning to show up. And the problem then is there a solution for that? I mean, do we see technology trying to solve these problems in a reasonable way using technology that we have? And the answer is positive. And we are beginning to see indications of a convergence that will lead to some solution. And I think the way to show that let's look at this picture here. This picture shows the national income per capita between 1990 and 2014 for two groups of countries, for the OECD countries, which is here, and for the developing countries, which is here. And this is the average. Both are growing. And this, of course, addresses the problem of the wide gap between the rich people, the rich countries, not only rich people, but not only rich countries, but rich people. And because inside countries you have wide discrepancies, and you see that they're both growing. But then when you look at the ratio between the consumption per capita for OECD to non-OECD, this is declining. So the ratio in 1990 was about 8. So it was a tremendous gap between the consumption in financial terms between OECD countries and non-OECD countries, and that is declining, which is encouraging, which means that the poor countries are becoming richer. So one of the great concerns is slowly disappearing. And of course, if you extrapolate these curves, then by 2100, you will probably have a much better situation than we have today. Now, When you look at the energy per capita, then this is the per capita energy consumption in OECD and non-OECD countries in the same, in this period, 1990 to 2013. Then we have here about 3, and this is approximately stable. It's very small indications of coming down. But in the developing countries, the energy consumption is growing much faster, mainly because of China, mainly because of the effect of China. If you remove China from this group, there is some growth, but there's a smaller growth in energy consumption per capita. So when you try to look for convergence, then there is convergence also between, so they're approaching the energy per capita consumption in rich countries and the less rich. The gap is also declining, so you expect this to achieve reasonable levels by the end of the century. So what you see here in these graphs, that the main problem, I mean, the main consequences of being rich is that the OECD countries, which represent only 1/4 of the world population, they consume much more energy than the others, and therefore they contribute much more to the consequences of consuming so much energy. And the great effort then is to try to put some order in that system and try to use technologies that will do it better. And this is happening. Actually, one thing that I want to mention here is that the technological developments that have been discussed during some of the discussions here with robots and all that and so on, they are fine, but they are going to consume energy too. So I think we should be aware that the wide use of internet and all that and so on doesn't come free either. So what we have to do is to develop this new technology. This is happening because renewables are coming into play, seriously coming into play. You know, 50 years ago, just to make a reference to the past, 50 years ago, anyone worrying about renewable energies was considered a bit strange, and that was a university discipline. It was something that we learned in school. And now Europe and Portugal, of course, is covered by windmills and all kinds of other devices. And as a result, you know, the rate of change in the atmosphere is beginning to slow down. And this is what's happening in Paris now. Of course, people always ask about what are the expectations for the Paris conference on climate change. And I think we should look at it philosophically. You know, the idea that wars are won at the conference table at the end of the war is completely mistaken. Wars are won on the battlefield. And this is what happened in the battlefield. Since 1992, when we had the Rio Conference on climate change, the first one, until now, what happens is that the key countries in the sense that they are the main emitters of these gases that are warming the globe and causing all these problems, have changed their positions. You know, the United States is really reducing their emissions, so is Europe, because of technological advances, which use today's technology. They do not depend on any futuristic technology. We have the technology for that, and that's coming into line. Then Europe and the United States represent about 1/3 of the world's emissions. And they took important steps in that direction. Of course, the United States Congress doesn't feel very enthusiastic about it, but the President of the United States, with the support of the Supreme Court, has taken steps which are realistic. Then China changed the position. China changed its position in the interest of the Chinese people, because the Chinese economy, as far as energy is concerned, is based on the use of coal. And coal is the main polluter, not only changing the composition of the atmosphere, which is a global problem, but producing the main pollutants at the local level, which are a main source of disease, respiratory diseases, and also quality of life. And as soon as people get richer, which did happen with the Chinese, one thing that they require is a decent environment. So China changed its policies, and it has adopted the position that it will not increase its emissions after 2030. Of course, we could ask for more, but that's still a very, very important decision. And the developing countries, which together with China, always oppose taking measures to curb emissions, are taking essentially the same position, including Brazil, which took actually a rather important decision in that respect. So now the developing countries are coming in. Not all of them, because India is resisting, but they are coming in. And therefore, you have the European Union, the United States, China, and a few of the key developing countries, such as Brazil, that have agreed in battles that took place inside their countries to reduce the emissions using technology that exists today. Therefore, we are in a direction in which we will be able to avoid great damage to the atmosphere. That means, generally speaking, improve the environment. And the problem that remains, of course, is bridging the gap. That is something that technology can facilitate, but cannot do by itself. It's a political matter. China is showing that it can be done. That is, they can grow economically and develop using technologies that are not damaging to the environment. And therefore, there is a way out, and the message regarding energy and environment is a positive one, in contrast to a number of pretty negative messages that we got here in the last 2 days, yesterday and today. Thank you.